Thank you for having me here and being here on this beautiful Saturday. And thank you to Nathan for the introduction. All of that was accurate. My research typically actually involves, well, a lot of gaps. I'm interested in gaps. And usually the gaps are between the self and somebody else. So how do you bridge that gap between who I am and who somebody else is and make decisions accordingly? This project is kind of not that at all. This is more maybe a gap between marketers and between customers and what their expectations are. And so I'll talk about something that's a little bit different for me, but I think is also an interesting and surprising effect that was inspired by one of Uber's many missteps. And I'm sure you're wondering which one. There are so many to choose from. It turns out I'm going to go old school and talk about, yeah, a nice ancient mistake of theirs, which is back in 2014. They got into a little trouble because some of their drivers might have been assaulting their customers. And it turns out people weren't a big fan of that. And so Uber realized they had to make sure they did a better job of vetting their drivers. And so they instituted a new background check program and then charged their customers for it. And they called it, delightfully, the Safe Rides fee, which people read on their bills and thought, wait a minute, isn't that the basic service you're providing me is a safe ride? Like, why am I paying extra for that? And it led to a lot of delightful headlines like this one about why is Uber charging me not to get assaulted? And yeah, that's a perfectly relevant question. And it's even more interesting when you think about why people got so offended by paying extra for a service they obviously desired to have when you compare it to something like, suppose instead the new charge had been for those little bottles of water that they give you in Uber, which is not a thing that typically comes with like a taxi ride. And I think obviously people would have been upset by that because they like things free instead of not free. But I think it wouldn't have caused the same degree of umbrage that the Safe Rides fee did. And so the question is, why is that? Why would this obviously desirable product that gets this extra charge lead to such offense by its customers? And so that's the question I'm going to try to answer, at least to some degree, today. This is an example of what's called partition pricing, and why it's called that is because it's part of what you have to pay for a product or service that's partitioned off. So it's mandatory, it's something that you are going to be charged for, you have to get, but it's treated as somehow a separate part of the price. And I'm sure you've all encountered this any number of times, even probably getting here, or even perhaps even today when you checked out from your hotel room. So things that fall under partition pricing include shipping fees online. It turns out that this is Banana Republic. I spent enough money in the last year to qualify for their fancy version. So now it's free for me as well for the fast version. But if I were to choose even faster shipping, I would pay that separate fee for that, even though I have to obviously get the thing shipped to me because I ordered it online. You see this a lot. Airlines are excellent examples of partition pricing. They do lots of it. And you can see an example here of a plane ticket from New York to London, how the base price is just under $1,700, but then you add on an extra almost $300 in terms of taxes and fees. And you can see some of these fees themselves are also, isn't that a thing that I have to get if I get in an airplane? So paying for things like fuel, you often see a fuel fee. You'll see a fee to use the airport. That often is part of the ticket, seems kind of important for flying. Things like security fee, like that obviously is a thing that I'm a big fan of security when it comes to airports, so obviously I'm willing to pay that, but again, it's treated as a separate thing that is not part of the base price, but yet I have to pay it. So that's partition pricing. It's different, of course, from an optional fee. So the luggage fee that you might have paid to check a bag, that is an optional fee. It's not partition pricing because it's not something you have to pay. It's something you opt into paying. Okay, so that's the basic outline of what this is. And so there's lots of things that make partition pricing seem fair, less fair, and on the whole, it turns out people actually appreciate it. It's pretty transparent to say, here is exactly what you're paying for when you pay for this product. That seems pretty nice. But of course, you can mess around with how fair it seems to have that partition price by playing around with things that determine, basically reference points is what I'm talking about. So reference points could be things like other people and what they pay. So my Luke's shipping, when it's free and fast, because I spent so much money at that store, might make your non-Luke's shipping fee seem a little bit less fair because I get an easier deal. So that could be one example of what makes it seem more or less fair. Past prices, of course, if you paid less before and pay more now, people obviously less of a fan of that as a way to partition off a price. And also things like just the amount of money. So the total of the partition price, obviously less is better for people. And likewise, how it compares to the base price. People get really bothered, in fact, if, say, the partition price is bigger than the base price, which sometimes can happen depending on what you're buying. And so those things all matter. And you can see a theme of all of this is that the reference point really determines how you feel about it. So reference points can be other people, they can be your past experience, they can be the base price, they can be $0, anything like that can serve as a reference point. And so your reference point makes you figure out how to feel about that particular thing. This is what is often called like a reference transaction. People have an idea of what they should be getting when they pay for a product or service. And they, of course, recognize that companies want to make money off of them. That's not a surprise. And so they do allow for that. So a reference transaction includes what's called a reference price, which is what you believe the cost of the product or service actually is, and then a little bit of reference profit. So companies can play around with this reference transaction a little bit and get people to still feel like it's okay or not. One thing that's not okay is that if you don't change the reference price, but add in some reference profit, people find that to be annoying. That they see what you're doing there, they don't care for it, it makes them mad. But you can increase prices and have people feel like it's okay by giving them more for their money and still allowing yourself to have some of that reference profit. So that middle one, bad, that bottom one, good. And that's where companies can start playing around with things like what is standard, what is extra, and what seems okay or not to charge as a partition price. And so what we're going to argue is that this idea, the simple idea, which I think is obviously a valuable thing to think about when it comes to how to charge for particular products and services, that reference price probably has a bunch of stuff in it. And what we would argue is that by splitting it up in this even way, it's a little bit oversimplified. And that, in fact, a reference price probably includes lots of things that are definitely going to be part of this product or service. So when you buy a car, for instance, an engine is not something they can partition off and charge you extra for. That is just not how it works. The car comes with an engine. Likewise, when you fly, you know that you get a seat, that you get to sit someplace on the plane. Unless you fly like Ryanair, where they, I think, have those weird standing seats, but that's a whole other thing. But it turns out there's lots of stuff that you can play around with that seems like part of a reference transaction, but may or may not be something you actually expect to have to pay for. So things like DVD players could be an example of that. Backup cameras now are going to be a thing where you're likely to get it, but it seems like a thing that's, okay, I can pay extra for that, that's fine. It's going above and beyond the typical purchase of a car. Starting next year, though, that will be part of what you have to pay for, and therefore how you feel about that might actually shift because it's no longer going to be an extra thing, it's going to be a standard thing. Okay, so we're talking about this idea of what happens when you pull from either that really definitely standard part of the reference price versus the things that might come with it, but could be seen as going above and beyond what you typically expect to get. And so we have lots of examples of all of this. I'll talk about a few studies, one of which will go over some things that I'm sure you've paid for yourself, even perhaps on this trip again. And we'll talk about how standard those fees are, how typical they seem to be as part of the typical transaction for a product or service, and how that makes you feel about how fair they are, how okay it is for a company to charge them, and how you even feel about the company itself. So our very first study looked at exactly this list of potential fees you could be charged in a partitioned way. And so you can see some of them I'd imagine you expect to pay extra for. So going beyond your cell phone data limit obviously seems like a thing. Like, it turns out it's a limit for a reason. So you can get that thing, but it's okay to be charged extra for it. It's above and beyond. Other things, like that third one there, when you get an oil change, they charge you often a separate fee to dispose of the used oil, which seems, again, kind of like something that should come with an oil change. They get rid of the oil for you. And so that might have a different response from people about how fair it is to charge for it. And so this very first study, we had two different pools of people indicate how they feel about these set of fees, all these fees. One thing they answered for one sample of people was just to indicate how standard versus above and beyond that particular thing is as part of the service. So is it typical to get your oil disposed of when you get an oil change? Is it typical to pay extra or not for using too much cell phone service? And so they indicated on a scale of 1 to 7 from standard to above and beyond how they felt about each of the fees. The other sample, they imagined the same set of fees, thought about them. And in this case, they thought about, suppose a company didn't offer this particular piece of their service, and yet starts to do so. And doing so, they partition off the price for that particular service. So in this case, if they have this new thing, they're charging you for it, it's part of the standard price, but it's separated off, how fair would it be to charge that particular fee? Okay, so how okay is it for you to have to pay extra, quote unquote, for that particular new service? And what you find is that there's actually a pretty strong relationship between how standard versus above and beyond the fee is and how fair it seems to be to have to pay for it. And that the more standard that service is, the less fair it seems to be to have to pay for it. And you can see what the different things are, how they kind of play out. The ones at the top, they include things like getting food delivered from a restaurant. People recognize that's kind of an extra thing for a restaurant to do. They're okay with paying a little bit extra for it. Likewise, rental insurance, when you rent a car, that obviously seems like an extra thing because a rental car is kind of an extra thing itself, and that seems okay. On the bottom, those included things like having to pay extra to return an item that you don't want to a store, having to pay for something with a credit card, paying a fee for that. That seems less fair and should be standard as part of paying for something. Paying for a bill online also is very similar, that it feels like a thing that should just happen, and therefore now newly paying this fee for it seems less fair. Okay, so there definitely seems to be a relationship in people's minds between how fair something is and how standard versus above and beyond that particular service is. And so we can start peeling apart what exactly is going on here, what kind of thing can serve as references, and why this particular weird feeling of unfairness might be happening. Okay, so all of us likely stayed in one of the lovely hotels here in New Haven. And may have noticed that there was a room service menu, probably on your bed even when you got in the room. And room service, while very handy, is also very expensive, as you might have noticed. And so room service typically includes sales tax, it includes a gratuity, and it includes often an in-room dining charge or some sort of service fee, which again seems strange to people because isn't that what the gratuity is for, is the delivery? And so it can seem often like a weird extra little bit of what you're paying for. And so we use that as the stimuli in this study here. And this is, of course, for maybe the one person in the room who watched Veronica Mars as carefully and religiously as I did, but the Neptune Grand was the hotel we used. And we gave people, in this case, a reference point that was what other hotels typically do. And so in one of the conditions, they were told that about 10% of hotels charge this in-room dining fee for room service, whereas the other 90% of hotels, they just include it by default in the room charge. So if you notice that, it turns out that everybody who gets it included automatically will pay for room service even if they get it or not. So that's actually kind of a worse deal. But as you see, they don't see it that way. In the other case, they were told that most hotels, in fact, charge this extra dining fee, whereas only a small percent of them think it's something that they should include automatically in the room. And so in one case, it's seen as standard to get room service as part of your room. In their case, it's seen as kind of an extra above and beyond thing. And what we see, if we ask people how fair that policy is, how good an idea it is to pay that particular fee, and whether the Neptune Grand Hotel is a good company that cares about its customers, we find that both in terms of the fee and in terms of the hotel, that it seems more okay to have to pay that fee, that in-room dining charge, when that seems like an extra thing to get, when most hotels don't include it, and it's something that extra fee pays extra for. Say, likewise, on the converse, if it seems that something that this is hotels typically include and I'm charging you extra for it, that seems less fair and the company is less of a good company. Okay, so that seems to be going on here as well, but you can imagine that it's possible that people don't quite interpret that automatically included charged fee for room service as being really part of a separate service. It could be seen as something else, and so we wanted to really dig into what happens if you explicitly label something as this fee and have people really know that it's something extra versus something very standard. And so we used everybody's favorite thing, convenience fees for services, which you might recognize from if you've ever bought a ticket through Ticketmaster. Lots of companies have that delightful marketing speak of calling it a convenience fee to do something that seems, again, very standard. And so here we used buying a movie ticket online. Weirdly enough, the second reference to A Dog's Purpose in 2 days. My RA picked it. I have no responsibility for the actual movie, but here we go. They were asked to imagine that they were going to see this with some friends, and they bought a ticket online. And so this ticket comes with 2 additional services beyond just the ticket to the movie. One of them was that you could print your ticket at home. The other was you could reserve your seat. Okay, so it turns out if you ask people what they think about those 2 services, one of them, printing, seems like it should just kind of come. If you buy something online, you can print up what you got. The other, seat reservations, seem very much like an extra bonus feature. Okay, so people have that intuition coming in. What we did is we told them, so you have a base ticket price. It includes these 2 services. One of them actually, though, is part of this convenience fee. So you're paying a separate fee for it. In one case, they were told that it was home printing, that if you pay this extra $150, what you're getting from it is the ability to print your ticket. In the other case, they were told it was the seat reservation fee. So by paying that $150, they get to reserve their seat. And so again, you see that it's the same price for everybody. They pay the same total, they get the same services. It's just what is labeled as this extra thing. That will, it turns out, affect how people feel about the ticket and the company. And so we asked them about the convenience fee, how good an idea was it, how fair, how moral, and about Hollywood Screenings, a supposed movie theater that put on this movie. Is it a good company? Does it treat its customers fairly, and so on? And again, what we find is that the more standard service, so printing in this case, if you charge that partition fee for it, it seems less fair and less of a good idea than when you pay for the seat reservations, the extra service in this case. And likewise, Hollywood Screenings seems like less of a good company if it would charge that extra fee for the thing that seems to come standard versus the thing that seems to be extra. Okay, so that really suggests that it really is the label for it. It's not anything about what you think the service is worth, anything about that kind of stuff. It really is what seems to be extra versus what seems to be standard. Okay, so the question is, why does this happen? Why do people get bothered by paying for a thing that they believe they should be getting no matter what? Because again, it can seem kind of backwards, that shouldn't you be happier to get the thing that obviously you're supposed to get, even if it is just separated off in the total mandatory charge? What we think is going on is that people kind of see this as, well, it turns out, why are you not doing this already? Again, with Uber, that idea of, isn't that what I should be getting anyway, a safe ride? And that by charging that extra fee for it, it seems like Uber is fixing it with your money, that they aren't doing what they are supposed to be. They're actually making you take charge of the problem and solve it for them. And so we looked at this in the context of paying for faster phone service, which again, something you might recognize as a service problem that could be potentially fixed in a way that would be helpful. They were told that this particular imaginary bank that we made up was going to charge a $1 faster phone service fee on their checking accounts. And that fee would reduce the waiting time from either 9 minutes to 5 minutes or from 5 minutes to 1 minute. And they were told the industry average, so what is typical, is 5 minutes. So in one case, it's going from worse than average to average. In other case, it's going from average to better than average. Okay, so in one case, it's extra, in one case, it's standard. And so we can look at, again, those same questions as before about the fee and the bank. And also we can ask them questions based on this idea that by charging this fee, they're making their bad hold times my problem. It's my responsibility to fix it because they're charging this extra fee. And what we find, again, that fixing it so that it just becomes average, that you're paying this fee to get average service, standard service, seems less okay than the better than average service. Likewise, the bank that would charge that, less cool. And similarly, but flipped in this case, the average fee, if I'm paying that, I am fixing their problem with my money, not theirs. And it turns out that responsibility measure mediates the difference between the two conditions and how people feel about both the fee and the bank. So the more you think it's your responsibility to fix their problem, the less okay with it you are. Okay. So all of that together does suggest that despite the fact that these fees pay for things that people like to get, I had a question.
Just a very quick question.
Sure.
If you measure cost inferences, it's kind of thematically, there's greater fairness if I think the supplier or the seller is incurring extra costs.
Yes, definitely. That's certainly true. We have done that a little bit. The one that I think really gets at it is the movie ticket one, where it's very clear that they're just paying for the servers to be running, and both of those things don't actually really cost the company anything. It's simply what they're being told the fee is for, and so that, I think, helps eliminate that as really the explanation, although I'd imagine definitely that end up being part of the inference more generally, that when you have a better thing, you're okay with paying more for it. So I think both of those things could be going on, that it's not just that, but that could certainly exacerbate the effect. So, yeah, good question. Oh.
The competition is growing, and as we see in the service sector, more and more companies are trying to be more inclusive rather than exclusive in giving those services. And then there's another question that when you see that, oh, these are charges are added, does it affect on your loyalty and customer satisfaction sort of thing? Because companies are competing, and they might have to take off something, their profit, but they want to win the customer in the long run so that they make more profit. And that's why you are talking of all those exclusive services and inclusive services. I'm understanding that as competition grows, the more and more is becoming a norm rather than an exception.
Yeah, and so I think part of the lesson, I'll talk about that on the very next slide, in fact, is that the more companies can do to shift around people's perceptions of what they're paying fees for. Being transparent about bonus stuff is a good thing. Being transparent about standard stuff is less good. And so that's a way you can have companies sort of help make themselves look better, is by making it very clear that what you're paying for is this thing that we go above and beyond on, not this thing that you expect to have happen. So yeah, I guess that's a good summary of the basic idea, is that paying for something that seems to be standard, it seems less okay. It seems less fair to have to pay that particular fee because I should be getting it anyway. Why am I helping you pay for this thing you should be giving me? As opposed to when something seems kind of like a bonus or above and beyond, it seems more acceptable to have to pay that extra set aside fee. And why this happens is that customers make inferences about what the company is trying to do. And in particular, I think that the company is trying to make them solve their problems for them. Just like I can imagine that was the inference that people made about Uber when they're charging this fee, is like, shouldn't you already have taken care of this when you're charging me for the ride in general? And so that is, I think, a typical feeling that customers have. What this means, some implications of this particular effect. One is, just kind of like we said, when you're thinking about how to be transparent with customers, customers really do appreciate transparency, so do that when you can. Make sure, though, that what you're transparent about is the stuff that goes above and beyond, the things that you do that are special and extra. That can help you seem like a better company, that the fees are more fair, because people expect to pay for that. They don't expect to pay for things that are more standard. This might actually have interesting implications for government services. It turns out that a lot of government services are what people call submerged, that people don't recognize that they get that by paying taxes. You may have heard back in 2008, there was the famous town hall where the man stood up and told, I forget who, John McCain maybe, to get his government hands off his Medicare. Yeah, that's a crazy thing to say when you think about it, but it means that it's really very true that lots of government services, people don't recognize that their taxes go to them and that they benefit from those services. Even things like home mortgage credits on your taxes, like people don't recognize the government is doing you a favor. That is what they're doing for you. And so by making it very clear that those things that seem to go above and beyond your typical tax expectations might help you feel more okay with paying taxes and with what the government is doing with your money. And so that could be an implication. Yeah.
Question.
Sure.
Overarching statement that basically people like transparency, and I think overarching that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
However, I get more angry with the more information you provide me in those kind of situations. Like when I'm on Expedia and I see everything line itemized, I'm okay with the overarching cost, but you also said a lot of times people are okay with the overarching costs.
Yeah.
But once you get into that transparency, that's when the anger monkeys come out. How do you
Yes.
look at if you just bake it into one line and that difference versus when you do get into, like you've looked at different articulations,
Yeah.
how you bring out the cost versus just throwing into taxes and fees, and what the relative difference is there.
Yeah, we haven't done that to kind of really break down exactly like all the chunks of the different fees. We've never done anything like that. We've really just split off one separate thing to be a little bit cleaner in our testing, but that is an interesting question to see.
And while we're talking about
Yeah.
this, how much of it is governed and you have to lay out in a specific way?
Yes.
You look at that also.
No, that's also a great point, that the things that, like all of the airline fees,
exactly.
They have to be transparent about that, or they did. I mean, things are shifting back again, but that was the thing they had to do. And so I think that is a good question. I'm not sure. I'd assume it kind of plays out in the same way, because often those things are things that you would expect to be mandatory, that I have to go to the airport, I have to have fuel on the plane, like those things seem normal. And so it might have obviously a good effect in terms of transparency, but maybe negative effects for the airlines, which is why they want to go back to not being quite so clear about what you're paying for, because it is often these things where you're like, isn't that what is in the ticket already? I don't understand. So yeah, that's an excellent point. Okay, other implications. This is a weird one for me to say. that this is an example of how being transparent might actually kind of backfire, that by breaking up your price into its individual components in a way that seems very clear and transparent and honest with your customers might actually make them kind of mad, just like you were saying. That in some cases it might be better for you just to kind of bury that charge in the total price rather than making it clear it's a separate thing that you're paying for. Yeah, that feels really kind of creepy to me to say it, but that is, I think, an obvious implication of this work. Or conversely, what you could do, if you wanted to be a marketer and take advantage of this, is to give more bang for the buck, to do things what you can to add bonus features to things and then charge for that, because that actually seems like a nice thing to do. Customers appreciate that rather than finding it quite so bothersome. And so if you'd rather still be transparent, what you can do is be transparent about the things that you do that are special to you, that are bonuses, that might give them more value for their money, at least in their own eyes. And so with that, I think I'm out of time. I wanted to thank my co-author, Yoel Imbar, who's at the University of Toronto. I want to thank you guys for having me here and you as an audience for being so attentive. Thank you very much.